George Miller sat near the back of the ballroom, his oversized suit jacket pulling awkwardly across his shoulders. The fabric was cheap, bought in a hurry from a discount chain because nothing in his closet fit anymore. He'd gained weight over the years. Stress, loneliness, the kind that settles in when you stop mattering to the people you love most. Around him, crystal chandeliers cast soft amber light over tables draped in silk, centerpieces blooming with orchids that cost more than his monthly groceries. This was his daughter Ava's wedding, but it didn't feel like his. It felt like a stage he'd been allowed to observe from the shadows, a guest in a world that had long since moved on without him. Ethan, the groom, stood at the microphone now, his smile sharp and confident, the kind that came easily to men who'd never been told no. He was handsome in that polished, catalog way, tailored tuxedo, hairstyle with just enough product to look effortless. He raised his glass, and the room quieted, expectant. George felt his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. He'd felt it all evening. The way Ethan's eyes had skimmed over him with barely concealed disdain. The way Ava had positioned him at a table far from the family, tucked between distant relatives who didn't know his name. Ethan cleared his throat and began his toast, voice warm and practiced, thanking everyone for coming, praising his bride, charming the crowd. Then, as if it were the most natural segue in the world, he turned his gaze toward George's corner of the room. And of course, Ethan said, grin widening, I have to thank my new family. Ava's dad, George. Stand up, George. Don't be shy. George didn't move. His hands were folded in his lap, knuckles white. Ethan laughed, the sound carrying easily over the microphone. Come on, big guy. Let everyone see the man who gave me this beautiful bride. Though I gotta say, George, if you'd warned me about the poor side of the family, I might have budgeted for a bigger cake. We need to make sure everyone gets fed, especially you, right? Laughter rippled through the crowd, polite and uncertain, the kind people give when they're not sure if a joke has gone too far but don't want to seem humorless. Ethan pressed on, emboldened. I mean, look at him. He's been hitting the buffet hard already. I told Ava, babe, your dad's like a fat pig at a trough. But hey, at least he showed up, right? The laughter was louder now, more comfortable, as if permission had been granted. George felt heat crawl up his neck, his vision blurring at the edges. Across the room, Ava sat frozen, her face pale, eyes locked on the table in front of her. She didn't look at him. She didn't defend him. She just sat there, a statue in a white dress, and George realized in that moment that she'd known this would happen. Maybe not the exact words, but the tone, the cruelty, she'd known, and she'd let it happen anyway. He wanted to stand, to walk out, to vanish into the night where no one would see the shame burning through him. But his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped, a spectacle, the punchline to a joke he hadn't agreed to be part of. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a man walked in. Richard Hayes. Even from across the room, George recognized him immediately. The same sharp jawline, the same self-assured stride, though the hair was grayer now, the lines around his eyes deeper. Richard was Ethan's father, a man who'd built his reputation on the myth of being self-made, a CEO who'd climbed from nothing to run a regional manufacturing empire. He wore success like a second skin, his suit immaculate, his presence commanding. Guests turned to watch him enter, and Ethan's voice faltered mid-sentence, his toes trailing off as he registered his father's arrival. Richard moved through the crowd with easy confidence, nodding at familiar faces, shaking hands, playing the role he'd perfected over decades. And then he saw George. His eyes landed on the man in the ill-fitting suit, the man everyone had just laughed at, and Richard stopped. His face drained of color, blood retreating so fast it left him looking ghostly under the chandeliers. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. For a man who'd spent his life commanding boardrooms, he suddenly looked lost, unmoored. He took a step forward, then another, his gaze never leaving George, as if pulled by some invisible thread. The room had gone quiet again, sensing something, though no one understood what. Richard reached the table, his hand gripping the back of a chair for balance. You, he said, voice barely above a whisper, but in the silence it carried. "What are you doing here?" George didn't answer. He simply met Richard's eyes, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that felt almost dangerous. Years ago, when Richard's company had been on the brink of collapse, debts mounting, creditors circling, the board ready to sell it for scraps, an anonymous investor had appeared. No one knew who they were, just that they quietly bought the controlling stake, restructured the debt, and let Richard keep his title, his office, his reputation. Richard had spent years wondering who his silent savior was, spinning theories, chasing ghosts. Now, standing in front of George Miller, the man his son had just humiliated in front of 200 people, Richard understood. The truth settled over him like a weight he couldn't lift. "It's you?" Richard whispered, and the words hung in the air, fragile and terrible. Ethan stared at his father, confusion flickering across his face. Ava looked up, finally, her eyes moving between George and Richard, trying to piece together what was happening. But George said nothing. He just sat there, hands still folded, shoulders still hunched, the quiet man who'd been invisible his entire life. Except now, in this moment, everyone was looking at him. And for the first time all evening, no one was laughing. The story of George Miller didn't begin at that wedding. It began years earlier, in a life so ordinary that no one bothered to look twice. He lived in a small two-bedroom house on the edge of town, the kind with peeling paint and a lawn that needed mowing more often than he got around to it. His car was 15 years old, rusting at the wheel wells. His clothes came from outlet stores, always a size too big because he'd stopped caring about how he looked after his wife died. To neighbors, to distant family, to anyone who crossed his path, George was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who'd survived loss but never quite recovered, someone getting by on contract work and Social Security, fading into the background of his own life. But that was the story George wanted them to see. The truth was something else entirely. Before cancer took her, George's wife Sarah had been a systems engineer, brilliant in ways the world rarely recognized because she worked in unglamorous industries, logistics, supply chain management, the invisible machinery that kept goods moving across continents. George had been her partner in every sense, not just in marriage but in work. Together, late at night at their kitchen table, they developed software that optimized shipping routes and warehouse distribution with an elegance that seemed almost simple once you understood it. The kind of innovation that didn't make headlines but saved companies millions in operational costs. They'd patented it quietly, licensed it to a handful of major shipping firms, and watched as those firms couldn't function without it. The licensing fees came in steadily, year after year, quiet rivers of income that George reinvested with the same methodical precision Sarah had taught him. No flashy purchases, no announcements, just disciplined, patient capital allocation, index funds, real estate in overlooked markets, bonds that matured slowly but reliably. Over a decade, those streams compounded into something most people would never accumulate in a lifetime. George became a millionaire not through luck or inheritance, but through competence no one knew he possessed. He wore his anonymity like armor, letting the world assume he was ordinary because ordinary people were left alone, unbothered by expectations or envy or the complications that came with visible wealth. One of his most strategic investments came during the financial crisis, when Hayes Industrial Group, Richard's manufacturing company, was circling the drain. The company made precision parts for aerospace and defense contractors, solid fundamentals buried under a mountain of mismanaged debt and poor leadership decisions. Richard had expanded too fast, borrowed too aggressively, and when the economy contracted, his creditors came calling. The board was ready to liquidate. George saw the opportunity immediately. He purchased a controlling stake through a network of shell entities and holding companies, names that meant nothing, signatures that led nowhere. He restructured the debt, brought in competent financial management, and let the company stabilize. Richard kept his title, his corner office, his reputation as a self-made success story. All he had to do was sign away control to investors he never met and never tried to understand. Richard had blamed faceless capital in interviews, painting himself as a victim of Wall Street vultures who'd swooped in during his moment of weakness. He never considered that the quiet man who would one day become his son's father-in-law was the one who'd saved him. Why would he? George was overweight, underdressed, unremarkable. A man who looked like he'd given up, not someone who controlled assets worth more than Richard's entire net worth. And George let him believe it. He let everyone believe it. Even Ava. Especially Ava. Because somewhere along the way, George had learned a hard truth. People respected wealth more than they respected character, and he wanted to know who his daughter would become when she thought he had nothing left to offer. The wedding had given him his answer. And now, standing in that ballroom with Richard's face drained of color and recognition finally breaking through, George realized the performance was over. The invisible millionaire had just become visible. George had raised Ava alone after Sarah died, through middle school science fairs and high school heartbreaks, through college applications and late-night phone calls when the world felt too heavy. She'd been his entire universe, the reason he kept going when grief made every morning feel impossible. He remembered her as a girl who'd sit with him on the porch, asking questions about constellations and why people were mean to each other and whether heaven was real. She'd had her mother's curiosity, her kindness, her ability to see through pretense to the person underneath. George had believed, truly believed, that those qualities were permanent, woven into who she was. Then she met Ethan. It happened during her second year of graduate school, at some networking event where ambitious young professionals gathered to trade business cards and half-truths about their futures. Ethan was everything George wasn't: confident, polished, connected to a world of country clubs and executive boxes at sporting events. He drove a car that cost more than most people's houses. His family vacationed in places George couldn't pronounce. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, Ava began to change. Not in dramatic ways, not overnight, but in the small gestures that revealed who someone was becoming. She stopped mentioning George in conversations with Ethan's friends. She'd schedule visits home for afternoons instead of weekends, as if longer exposure might reveal something embarrassing. When George offered to help with wedding planning, she'd smiled tightly and said the coordinator had everything handled. Thank you, though. The dinners at Ethan's parents' house were the worst. Richard and his wife Diane hosted elaborate affairs, the kind where servers moved silently between courses and wine was discussed with the seriousness of geopolitics. George would arrive in his cleanest shirt, aware immediately that it wasn't clean enough, that his shoes were scuffed, that he didn't know which fork to use for the salad. They seated him at the far end of the table, near Ethan's younger cousins and an elderly aunt who didn't speak much. When Richard talked about business, mergers, acquisitions, quarterly earnings, the conversation flowed around George as if he were a piece of furniture. Ethan would lean back in his chair, laughing at his father's stories, occasionally glancing at George with something that looked like amusement, maybe pity. He'd make jokes, light and casual, about George's car breaking down again, about him ordering the cheapest in tree, about whether he'd stopped at the buffet on the way over. Ava would laugh, nervous and quick, her eyes darting between Ethan and her father as if trying to smooth over a moment that might become awkward if anyone examined it too closely. Afterward, driving home alone, George would replay those laughs in his mind. They hurt more than the jokes themselves, because they meant Ava was choosing Ethan's approval over her father's dignity. She'd call the next day sometimes, voice bright and determinedly cheerful, telling George he should really think about updating his wardrobe, maybe join a gym, take better care of himself so he didn't look so out of place at family events. She framed it as concern, as love, but George heard what she wasn't saying, that he embarrassed her now, that his existence in her new life required managing and apologizing for. He never corrected her assumptions about money. He never mentioned the portfolio, the properties, the quiet empire he'd built in Sarah's memory. Part of him wanted to see if Ava would love him without knowing, if a character would hold when tested by the seduction of wealth and status. Another part worried that if she knew, it would change her in ways he couldn't predict, make her a target for people like Ethan who measured worth in dollar signs. The wedding invitation arrived in an oversized envelope, embossed and heavy, the kind of paper that announced its own expense. George opened it at his kitchen table, reading Ava's name printed in elegant script next to Ethan's, and felt something break inside him that he hadn't known was still whole. That same afternoon, sitting in the quiet of his modest living room, he pulled up a financial report on his laptop. Hayes Industrial Group, the company Richard Hayes claimed to have rescued through sheer force of will and business acumen. George scrolled through the quarterly earnings, the debt ratios that had stabilized under his silent ownership, the profit margins that existed only because he'd made decisions Richard never knew about. He closed the laptop and stayed at the invitation for a long time, wondering if attending his daughter's wedding would be an act of love or self-destruction. In the end, he went, because that's what fathers do, even when their daughters have stopped seeing them. The reception continued, but the air had changed. Guests returned to their champagne and small talk, pretending they hadn't noticed the strange moment between Richard Hayes and the bride's father, but the pretending itself was evidence they had. George remained at his table, hands still folded, watching the room move around him like water around a stone. Richard stood near the bar, his face pale, his grip on a whiskey glass tight enough that his knuckles showed white. He kept glancing at George, then away, then back again, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose answer terrified him. Finally, after 20 minutes of this silent dance, Richard crossed the ballroom and leaned close to George's ear. "We need to talk," he said, voice low and urgent. "Now, privately." George rose without a word and followed Richard out of the main hall, down a carpeted corridor lined with photographs of the venue's previous weddings. Other families, other celebrations, other fathers who'd probably felt less invisible than he did. Richard opened the door to a small lounge, the kind reserved for bridal parties to rest between photos, and closed it behind them. The sounds of the reception became muffled, distant. Richard turned to face George, and for the first time all evening, the commanding presence he'd worn like armor was gone. He looked older suddenly, vulnerable in a way that money couldn't hide. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard's voice cracked slightly. "All these years. You were at those dinners, those meetings before the wedding. You sat there while He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but George knew what he meant. "While we treated you like nothing." George didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens where guests had gathered earlier for cocktails, where Ava had taken her photographs, where Ethan had posed with groomsmen who laughed too loud and drank too much. "You didn't want to know," George said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "When your company was failing, when the board was ready to sell everything for scrap, you signed those documents without reading them. You took the money, kept your title, blamed faceless investors for swooping in. You never once asked who they were or why they'd bother saving a sinking ship." Richard's jaw tightened. "I was trying to save my legacy. Jobs. My family's future." George turned to face him. "I saved 1,700 jobs, Richard. I restructured $43 million in debt. I brought in competent financial management and let you keep a consulting position worth more annually than most people make in a decade. Not because you earned it, but because the employees who built that company with their hands deserve leadership that wouldn't crater their pensions out of ego." The words hung between them, precise and unanswerable. Richard's mouth opened, closed. He looked like a man watching his own mythology dissolve in real time. "Ethan doesn't know," he said, and it wasn't a question, it was a plea. "He can't know. If he finds out that we've been," he couldn't say it, couldn't voice the humiliation of realizing that the man his son had called a fat pig, the man they'd seated at the back of the ballroom like an afterthought, was the reason Richard's wealth still existed. George studied him for a long moment. This man who'd built an entire identity on being self-made, on pulling himself up through brilliance and grit, when the truth was he'd been saved by someone he'd never bothered to see. "I'm not going to lie," George said. "I never have. But I'm also not interested in revenge. The truth will surface when it needs to. What you do with that knowledge is your choice." Richard's face went from pale to ashen. "Please, George, think about Ava. This will ruin the marriage before it even starts." And there it was, the final card, played with the desperation of a man who had no others. George felt something twist in his chest, not anger exactly, but a deep, aching sadness. Richard thought Ava's happiness depended on maintaining the lie, on keeping George small and invisible so the family's carefully constructed hierarchy wouldn't collapse. Maybe he was right. Maybe the truth would shatter everything. Or maybe it was already shattered, and everyone was just too invested in the fiction to notice. George walked to the door, his hand on the handle. "I'm going back to the reception," he said. "You should too. People will wonder." He left Richard standing there, surrounded by expensive furniture and the weight of his own fear. When George returned to the ballroom, he felt eyes on him immediately. Ava was watching from the head table, her expression unreadable, caught between confusion and something that might have been concern. Ethan stood beside her, laughing at something a groomsman said, oblivious or unconcerned, still riding the high of his own cruelty from earlier. But Richard followed moments later, his face carefully neutral now, practicing the composure he'd spent decades perfecting. He walked straight to Ethan, whispered something sharp and quick that made his son smile falter. Ethan's eyes cut to George, then back to his father, and for the first time that night, George saw uncertainty flicker across the groom's face. Ava noticed too. Her gaze moved from her new husband to her father, studying the tension like someone trying to read a language she'd forgotten. The seed was planted now, small but undeniable, the first crack in a foundation everyone had assumed was solid. The days after the wedding felt longer than they should have. George returned to his quiet house, to routines that had sustained him through years of deliberate invisibility. Morning coffee on the porch, financial reports read in silence, evenings spent with books Sarah had loved and he'd never finished. But the silence felt different now, heavier, as if the confrontation of the wedding had disturbed something that couldn't be put back to rest. Richard was moving. George could feel it the way sailors feel storms coming, a pressure in the air that preceded action. 3 days after the reception, George's longtime financial advisor, a discreet woman named Patricia who managed his portfolio through layers of entities and trusts, called with a tone that immediately put him on alert. "Someone's been asking questions," she said, poking around the shell structures tied to Hayes Industrial. Professional inquiries, the kind that come from lawyers or forensic accountants. They are trying to trace ownership. George had expected this. Richard was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. Once the initial shock wore off, he would do what powerful men always did: gather information, assess threats, build leverage. What George hadn't expected was how quickly Ethan would become involved. Patricia mentioned that the inquiries had expanded beyond Hayes Industrial to other holdings, other investments, as if someone was trying to map the full extent of George's wealth. That wasn't Richard's style. That was someone younger, hungrier, looking for opportunity rather than damage control. George thanked Patricia, assured her the structures would hold, and hung up feeling something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. Not because his assets were at risk, but because Ava was now married to someone who saw her father as a puzzle to solve, possibly a resource to exploit. 4 days after the wedding, Ava visited. She called ahead, which she never used to do, her voice artificially bright on the phone. George made tea, the kind Sarah had preferred, and waited. When Ava arrived, she looked tired despite the professional makeup and expensive clothes that had become her uniform. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done homework as a child, where they'd eaten countless dinners in comfortable silence. Now the silence felt calculated, rehearsed. "Dad," she began, her fingers wrapped around the teacup but not drinking. "Ethan and I have been talking about the future. Planning, long-term stuff." George nodded, waiting. "And I was wondering, if there's anything about your finances we should know. For planning purposes. We don't want you to struggle as you get older, and if there are debts or issues, we want to help." The words were kind on the surface, but George heard what lived beneath them. The phrasing was too careful, too corporate, planning purposes, long-term stuff, language that didn't belong to his daughter but to someone coaching her. She thought he was broke, or close to it, a burden waiting to happen. Wise, she'd been sent to extract information, to assess whether her father's poverty might become her problem. George felt the sting of it, sharper than Ethan's insults at the wedding, because this came wrapped in concern, in love distorted by assumptions she'd never bothered to verify. "I'm managing fine, sweetheart," George said gently. "You don't need to worry about me." Ava's eyes flickered with something, frustration maybe, or disappointment that he hadn't given her what she'd come for. But if something happens, if you need help with medical bills or the house, you'd tell us, right? Us, not me. Them. The unit she'd become, the merged identity that prioritized Ethan's worldview over her own memories of who her father was. George reassured her again, vague but kind, offering nothing concrete for her to report back. She left 20 minutes later, hugging him at the door with an embrace that felt more like obligation than affection. He watched her drive away in a car that cost more than his house, and wondered when exactly he'd lost her, if there'd been a single moment or just an accumulation of small surrenders. That same evening, Patricia called again. The inquiries had intensified. Whoever was digging had resources and motivation, and they were getting closer to discovering that the modest man in the discount suit controlled assets that dwarfed the Hayes family's entire net worth. George made a decision then, one he'd been avoiding for years. He authorized Patricia to prepare documentation, a full accounting of his holdings, trusts, and the history of his involvement with Hayes Industrial Group. Not to hide anymore, but to be ready when the truth inevitably surfaced. Meanwhile, in the Hayes family's sprawling home across town, Ava had returned from visiting her father feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't articulate. Ethan was in Richard's study, the door partially open, voices raised in a way that drew her attention. She approached quietly, not intending to eavesdrop but unable to ignore the tension in Ethan's tone. "Is hiding something," Ethan was saying. "Your reaction at the wedding, the way you've been acting since. There's money there, Dad. I can feel it." Richard's voice was lower, harder to hear, but Ava caught fragments. "You don't understand. Complicated. Need to be careful." Ethan cut him off. "Careful?" He's old, overweight, and alone. "Once we lock in access to whatever he's sitting on, we're set. Ava's his only family. Everything eventually flows to her, which means to us." The words landed on Ava like ice water. Lock in access. As if her father were a vault to crack, a problem to solve. She stood frozen in the hallway, her hand against the wall for balance, watching through the gap in the door as her husband paced and her father-in-law sat hunched in his leather chair, both of them discussing George Miller like he was a transaction rather than a person. The shock on her face was complete, the final remnants of her illusions about her marriage crumbling in real time. The meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown office building, neutral territory that belonged to neither family. Patricia sat at the head of the table, her presence quiet but authoritative, flanked by a corporate lawyer George had retained specifically for this occasion. George arrived first, dressed in a suit that actually fit, tailored, understated, the kind of clothing that whispered competence rather than shouting wealth. When Ethan and Richard entered together 10 minutes later, Ethan's eyes swept over his father-in-law with visible surprise, as if the change in wardrobe had somehow altered the man himself. Richard looked worse than he had at the wedding, shadows under his eyes, his normally perfect posture slightly hunched. Ava came last, alone, her expression guarded and tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights spent replaying conversations and questioning everything you thought you knew. They settled into chairs around the polished table, and the tension was immediate, palpable. Ethan leaned back with practiced casualness, one ankle crossed over his knee, the posture of someone who believed he controlled the room. Richard sat rigidly upright, hands folded on the table, eyes darting between George and the lawyer as if trying to predict where the threat would come from. Ava positioned herself slightly apart from Ethan, a distance of maybe 6 inches that felt like a canyon. George remained still, his hands resting calmly in front of him, and when Patricia nodded for him to begin, he simply gestured for Ethan to speak first. "We appreciate you agreeing to meet, George," Ethan started, his voice smooth and confident, the same tone he'd used at the wedding before calling his father-in-law a fat pig. "Ava and I have been thinking about the future, about family stability, and we wanted to propose something that benefits everyone." He slid a folder across the table, glossy and professionally bound. "A family trust structure. You'd contribute a significant portion of your assets. We're thinking in the range of $2 to $3 million to start, into a shared vehicle that I would help manage. This way, we ensure professional oversight, tax efficiency, and that Ava's interests are protected as your primary heir. The audacity of it hung in the air like smoke. Richard shifted uncomfortably, not meeting George's eyes. Ava stayed at the folder as if it might explode. George picked it up, flipped through the pages slowly, his expression neutral. The proposal was sophisticated, layered with legal terminology designed to obscure its true nature, a mechanism for transferring control of George's wealth to Ethan under the guise of family planning. There were clauses about advisory roles and co-management responsibilities that essentially gave Ethan signatory authority over investments. It was predatory, wrapped in the language of care. George set the folder down and looked directly at Ethan. "How much did this cost to put together?" he asked. Ethan blinked, thrown by the question. "I'm sorry." George gestured at the document. "This level of estate planning, the legal work, 5,000. 10. More." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not really relevant." The point, George interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, "is that you've invested time and money into accessing assets you don't know I have, based on speculation and your father's reaction at your wedding." He nodded to Patricia, who opened her own folder and began distributing documents around the table. "These are financial disclosures related to Hayes Industrial Group. The debt structure at the time of acquisition, the terms of the bailout, the shell entities that purchased controlling interest." Richard's face went gray. Ethan leaned forward, scanning the pages with growing confusion. "What is this?" George let the question hang for a moment. 12 years ago, your father's company was 3 months from bankruptcy. The board had already drafted liquidation plans. I purchased a controlling stake through intermediary entities, restructured $43 million in debt, and installed competent management. Your father kept his title and a consulting position that currently pays him $320,000 annually, not because he negotiated well, but because I arranged it. The room went silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Ethan stayed at the documents, then at his father, then back at George. "You're saying you own Hayes Industrial?" George shook his head. "I own the majority stake through trusts. Your father runs day-to-day operations, but strategic decisions require my approval. He's known this for years. You apparently didn't." Ethan turned to Richard, betrayal and fury warring on his face. "You told me we owned that company. You said you built it." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, couldn't find words that wouldn't make everything worse. Patricia continued, her voice professional and detached. "We've also documented multiple attempts over the past 2 weeks to investigate Mr. Miller's financial holdings. Inquiries to banks, forensic accounting firms, attempts to trace ownership of various entities. These originated from legal contacts retained by the Hayes family." She slid another set of papers across the table. "Phone records, billing statements, email correspondence." Ava's hands were shaking now, staring at evidence that her husband and father-in-law had been hunting through her father's private affairs like scavengers. Ethan recovered first, his face flushing red. "So what? You set us up, played poor so you could feel superior?" George's expression didn't change. "I lived quietly because I preferred it. I didn't tell Ava about my finances because I wanted to see who she'd become without that knowledge influencing her. Clearly, I learned what I needed to." The words landed on Ava like stones, and George saw her flinch, but he pressed forward. "Here's what I'm offering. I will establish an irrevocable trust for Ava and any future grandchildren, education, medical emergencies, genuine needs. The trust will be under my sole control during my lifetime, with professional trustees after. Neither Ethan nor his parents will have access or oversight." He turned to Richard. "I'll maintain your consulting arrangement for 2 more years at current compensation. After that, you're on your own. In exchange, you and your son sign an agreement to cease all investigation into my affairs and never again attempt to manipulate or coerce Ava regarding my finances." Ethan exploded out of his chair, the K-full mask finally shattering. "You arrogant son of a bitch. You think you can waltz in here and dictate terms? That money is Ava's inheritance. She's your daughter, for God's sake." George remained seated, utterly still. "The money is mine. Ava is my daughter, which is why I'm protecting her from you." The truth of it echoed in the glass and steel, impossible to ignore. Ethan turned to Ava, his voice shifting to something that might have been pleading if it weren't so desperate. "Ava, you see what he's doing, right? He's trying to control you, control us. This is emotional manipulation." But Ava was watching her husband with new eyes, seeing how quickly he'd pivoted from confidence to rage the moment money was threatened, how every word out of his mouth centered on access and control rather than concern for her or her father. She looked at Richard, who sat frozen, calculating whether survival was worth swallowing his pride. Then she looked at George, at the man she'd been embarrassed by, ashamed of, the man who'd sat quietly through humiliation at his own daughter's wedding and never once defended himself or exposed the truth that would have destroyed his tormentors. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you tell me?" George met her eyes, and for the first time since the meeting began, his composure cracked slightly. "Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had. I see now that was naive." The silence that followed was complete, broken only when Ethan grabbed his jacket and stormed toward the door, his exit as dramatic as his cruelty had been casual. Richard remained seated, staring at the documents that proved his empire was built on someone else's mercy. Ava walked out of the conference room without looking back, her heels clicking against marble floors that suddenly felt too loud, too exposed. She didn't follow Ethan to the elevator where he stood jabbing the button with increasing violence. She didn't wait for Richard, who remained seated at the table like a man watching his carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time. She took the stairs, 14 flights down, needing the physical exertion to process what she'd just witnessed. Not just the documents and revelations, but the speed with which her husband had transformed from charming to vicious the moment money was denied him. By the time she reached the ground floor, her legs were shaking and her mind was clear. She called a lawyer that afternoon, someone independent of both families, and began the process of separation. Not out of anger, though anger was there, but out of clarity. Her marriage had been built on assumptions she'd never questioned, status she'd valued over substance, and Ethan's quiet calculation that marrying George Miller's daughter meant eventually inheriting George Miller's money. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. Ethan contested it initially, cycling through phases of fury, manipulation, and finally cold pragmatism when his lawyers explained that Ava had no access to her father's fortune and no legal claim to assets George had placed in irrevocable trust. Richard signed George's agreement 3 days after the meeting, his signature shaky but present, trading pride for survival. The consulting income continued, and Richard kept his office, his title, and the fiction that he'd built something himself, though now he knew, every single day, that his comfort existed at George Miller's discretion. Ethan refused to sign. He stormed away from multiple attempts at negotiation, convinced that his father-in-law was bluffing, that the wealth couldn't be as protected as George claimed. Within 6 months, Ethan's own ventures, real estate speculation funded by loans he'd secured based on his family's reputation, began to unravel. Without the bailout he'd been counting on, without access to capital he'd assumed would eventually flow through Ava, his investments collapsed under their own leverage. George watched from a distance, unmoved. Patricia kept him updated with brief summaries, and each time George simply nodded and returned to his life, which had quietly begun to change. He started walking in the mornings, at first just around the block, then longer routes through the park where Sarah used to drag him on weekends when she was worried about his health. The weight came off slowly, not because anyone had shamed him into it, but because he'd stopped using food as a shield, stopped letting his body be the armor that kept the world from expecting anything from him. He joined a gym, hired a trainer who didn't care who he was or what he was worth, just pushed him to lift heavier and run farther. By autumn, George had lost 40 pounds. His face looked different in the mirror, sharper, more like the man he'd been when Sarah was alive, when they'd stayed up late coding together and dreaming about what their software might become. He bought new clothes, not expensive ones, just things that fit properly, and discovered he didn't mind being seen anymore. The invisibility that had protected him for so long no longer felt necessary. George also started volunteering at a local tech incubator, The kind of scrappy operation where 20-somethings worked on prototypes in converted warehouse space and survived on ramen and optimism. He didn't introduce himself as an investor or mention his background. He just showed up Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, offering to review code, debug systems, talk through business models with founders who reminded him of himself 30 years earlier. Smart, hungry, underestimated by people who couldn't see past their youth or unconventional presentations. The kids called him George, asked his opinion on architecture decisions and pricing strategies, and never once treated him like he was old or irrelevant. It felt more meaningful than any board meeting he'd ever attended through proxy votes. Ava started visiting again. Real visits. Not the obligation-driven afternoons where she checked her phone every 10 minutes and left as soon as politeness allowed. She came for dinner, helped him cook meals that were healthier than either of them used to eat, sat on the porch where they'd watched stars when she was young. She asked about his work at the incubator, about the founders he was mentoring, and George could see genuine interest in her eyes, not the rehearsed concern she'd shown when she thought he was struggling, but authentic curiosity about who her father actually was. One evening, as they cleaned dishes together, Ava said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not because of the money, because you never let them make you small, even when I did." George's hands stilled in the soapy water. "You were trying to fit into a world that told you I didn't belong. That's not your fault." Ava shook her head. "I'm an adult. I made choices. I'm sorry for them." George dried his hands and hugged her, the kind of embrace that didn't need words, that said forgiveness and grief and hope all at once. Months turned into a year. Richard remained at Hayes Industrial, humbled but functional, the myth of his self-made success replaced by the quieter reality of competent management under someone else's ownership. Ethan faded from their lives entirely. Last heard of working for a mid-tier firm in another city, his reputation damaged enough that the easy doors he'd once walked through stayed closed. And George continued his quiet life, no longer invisible but no longer needing to be seen, content in a way he hadn't been since Sarah died. He'd learned something in the wreckage of his daughter's wedding and the confrontation that followed, that silence in the face of cruelty wasn't peace, it was surrender. That protecting people from uncomfortable truths didn't make them stronger, it made them vulnerable to those who'd exploit their ignorance. Sometimes love meant letting illusions shatter, even when the breaking hurt everyone involved. Because on the other side of that pain, if you were lucky, was the possibility of something real. And real, George had discovered, was worth more than any fortune he'd ever built.